Can I draw a line between, maybe not the collapse of Lehman, but that whole period and what we are now experiencing? Sort of, can I draw a line between Lehman Brothers and populism? Can I draw a line between Lehman Brothers and Brexit?
So I think one should be careful in using the phrase populism. It's like the word austerity. People devise these words to represent something they don't like without being clear about the meaning of it. So populism has many illustrations, if you like. In Southern Europe, it's a perfectly rational rejection of excessive fiscal consolidation to cope with a badly designed monetary union. I understand why people think that. In the United States, populism is about the reaction by those people whose wages have been held down through a combination of technological developments and globalization. They feel left behind. They haven't benefited in the way that people in New York and other metropolitan centers have from the benefits of the globalization of the last 30 years. They feel left out, ignored, and their real wages have been depressed. So that's a different motive for it. And I think in the case of Brexit, it was a very clear referendum on a very specific issue, which was should the UK remain a member of the European Union. It wasn't about wages or anything else. And I think people should respect that. The idea that the British population was hoodwinked in a referendum because they really were concerned about wages or something else, as opposed to membership of the European Union, I think is a rather arrogant view. It
wasn't. There is an argument that says that it was the rest of the country lashing out at London, lashing out at the financial community as a result of the hardship that was experienced post the financial crisis.
Well, I think there are many lines that you could draw leading towards so-called populism. I think the financial crisis was certainly one of them, and I think the reason for that is that in the 30 years before that, a lot of ordinary people, or a lot of small businesses, had accepted that the discipline of the market, even though it's unpleasant when you discover that your firm is not winning orders and so jobs go and the firm goes out of business, is nevertheless the right way forward to a thriving market economy which can generate productivity growth and higher real wages. So they bought into that. Come the financial crisis, well, having refused to bail out weak firms in the 30 years beforehand, it looked as if the government was bailing out banks. Now, there was a very good reason for that, which is if the banks had failed, the whole economy would have ground to a halt. And we tried to explain that. I was very clear. I would say in Parliament that we're not doing this to protect the banks. We're trying to do this to save the economy from the banks. And that was the key message. But I understand why it wasn't one that was easy to absorb and it was painful, because we had not been able to say to people beforehand, look, essentially we've put in place an insurance policy for banks. If there ever comes a moment when they would need to borrow from the Bank of England, they will be able to borrow. But they pay the price for that insurance policy in every year beforehand when there isn't a crisis. I think that can be explained to people and they will understand and accept it. But that wasn't done, and I think that's the big lesson for the future, is that we need to do that.
Is Brexit a good thing for Britain, do you think?
Well, people have different views on it. I myself don't think it's going to make a dramatic difference. I think you can argue that being a sovereign nation, having control over our own borders, is a big plus. You can also argue that if you want to genuinely be part of a European Union where we accept a high degree of political unity with other countries, it's a bad thing. People can take different views on it. It isn't an argument where it's obvious what is right or wrong. But I think what was so depressing, what is still depressing about the debate, is why both sides of this argument are absolutely convinced that they know the consequences very clearly. One side thinks they'll be disastrous, the other side thinks that we'll be a land of milk and honey.
Yep.
Neither side is right on that. And what we needed to do back in 2016 was to say, look, we had a referendum campaign, we got a result. Both sides in the campaign said very clearly, there's no doubt about this, that leaving means leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. Prime Minister Theresa May reiterated that on more than one occasion. Here we are, 2 years later, more than 2 years later now, and we still don't know what the arrangements are going to be for single market, customs union, etc., etc. None of this was necessary if proper planning had been put in place right back in 2016. So our political system has made a mess of it. It's not the decision to leave or stay in the EU that's made a big difference. It's the political consequences of that discussion and vote that have caused the problems, not the underlying economics of it.
Just one final quick question on Brexit. There are some that say that Brexit is kind of comparable for the City of London to Lehman Brothers. Is that are they in any way comparable?
No, they're not comparable at all.
Will the effects be comparable?
No, the Lehman Brothers was something that we knew the banking system was undercapitalised, but the final few days of Lehman Brothers were dramatic and could have led to a collapse of the entire US financial system. Brexit is not remotely comparable with that. But the other side of the coin is that solving the problem of the banking failures in the US and the UK at that time was relatively straightforward, and by the time we got to spring of 2019, the banking crisis as such was over. Resolving the issues surrounding Brexit will take much, much longer. So it's a much more drawn-out process of solving a whole sequence of practical problems. But the long-run consequences, 30 or 40 years down the road, we don't know what they'll be, is the only honest answer. We just don't know. But you know, I find it hard to see why they should be really significant in comparison with a collapse of the financial system and the economy grinding to a halt, a repeat of the 1930s Great Depression, or indeed the sort of changes we've seen in our own economy in the last 40 or 50 years. Just don't think it's going to be quite such a big event. What it is a very dramatic political event. It's our political system that's collapsed, not our economy.
Is the City of London, just to kind of draw a line between the two in a slightly different way, dealing with the crisis of Lehman Brothers, as you've said, was in many ways quite a sort of straightforward process. Getting the rules and regulations sort of after that, and to some of your points that you've made, right, was a much more difficult challenge to achieve. Do you think, where are we now in terms of your view, in terms of the safety of the financial system? Have we put the right rules in place? Are there things that we still need to do?
So I think, as I said before, the banking system is safer than it was then, but it's not safe. There are still things that we ought to be doing, in my judgment, in order to make a run on the banking system much less likely. And I think it's debatable whether banks have issued enough capital.
So what's the biggest risk now? Where kind of, as you look at the financial landscape?
So I think the big lesson from what happened was that people could see that what was happening in the world economy was unsustainable, but you couldn't forecast exactly where the problems would blow up. And I don't think it makes sense to say, where will the next crisis be? The right question to ask is, when the next crisis occurs and we face a problem, what are we going to want to do? Answer is, we'll need to lend money to the banking system to keep it afloat. Have we put in place a system of regulation which ensures that the banking system is sufficiently resilient? And I'm not sure that we've done enough to make it sufficiently resilient. It's a question of judgment, but I would like to see much more done in terms of making banks pre-position collateral so that they are in a position to borrow from the central bank, a sort of insurance policy for the banking system, which is politically acceptable. The key thing is to explain this to people in advance so that when the government takes action to lend money to commercial banks, people understand, yes, this is simply the playing out. The accidents happened. This is the insurance policy to which they're entitled because they paid for it in the past. That's the key thing I think we need to do.
Mervyn King, thank you very much indeed.